There we go. Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Hillary Carr, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with Mohammed H. Zaman presenting his new book, Biography of Resistance, The Epic Battle Between People and Pathogens, joined in conversation by Kevin Outterson. Thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these unprecedented times. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. As always, our events schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com/events. As always, where you can sign up for our new email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Biography of Resistance on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last few months, our technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Dr. Mohammed H. Zaman is the Howard Hughes Medical Institute Professor of Biomedical Engineering and International Health at Boston University. He writes a weekly column for the leading Pakistan daily paper, the Express Tribune, on innovation in health and education, and is a regular contributor on issues of drug quality control and global health for Project Syndicate and the Huffington Post. He is an award-winning researcher and teacher with recognition from the American Society for Engineering Education, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the University of Texas System, Boston University, and numerous others. Tonight, Professor Zaman will be joined by Kevin Outterson, professor and co-director of the healthcare law program at BU. He also serves as the executive director and principal investigator for CARB-X, a $500 million international public-private partnership to accelerate global antibacterial innovation. Tonight, they will be discussing Professor Zaman's latest book, Biography of Resistance. The Wall Street Journal said that in Biography of Resistance, Mr. Zaman's optimism is welcome, though not always easy to share. Still, his sense of urgency is irresistible. And Kirkus called it a vivid portrayal of our fight against an opponent that has been around for more than 3 billion years, and a compelling call to action demanding that governments and scientists rise to the challenge. We're so happy to have them both here tonight. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Professor Outterson and Professor Zaman.
Thank you so much, Hillary. Really appreciate the opportunity. I know it's late in the day, so really honored that people took the time out of their busy schedules to come and be a part of the conversation. I hope everybody's doing well, not only because of the current pandemic, but also the other social currents in the current sort of environment that we all live in. And I hope everybody is doing well and taking care of each other in this difficult time. So I'll share my screen. Give me a second. All right, so let me just see. Great. Kevin, can you see the screen? Great. So I want to talk about the sort of history of antibiotic resistance, the current moment in time that we live in, but also talk a little bit about why some of our assumptions may be wrong when it comes to antimicrobial resistance, and why it is no longer a problem of science alone that we need to address, and it needs to be much broader and much more inclusive. Before I start, I want to talk a little bit about the great 1918 pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu, that has been sort of brought up in many conversations over the last 3.5, 4 months. This pandemic, this sort of global event, really touched lives all around the world, and people were affected in every corner of the world. In India, Gandhi got sick. In the former Ottoman Empire, Mustafa Kemal, the founder of Turkey, was sick, and T.S. Eliot got really ill as well. I grew up in Pakistan, which in 1918 was an undivided India, and 40% of all the people who died lived in that part of the world. So the numbers are about 50 million people who died, 20 million of those lived in India. There was not enough place in Ganges for anybody to even see water. There were so many bodies. Why do I bring this up today? I bring this up today because there is discussion in the scientific community that partly the deaths, perhaps increasingly at that time, were not just because of the virus, the viral influenza, but because of bacterial pneumonia. The person who really sort of brought this discussion to the fore is one whose name has become synonymous with the pandemic in this country, and that is Tony Fauci. In a 2008 paper, and I've highlighted that here, he argued that the majority of the deaths in 1918-1919 influenza pandemic likely resulted directly from secondary bacterial pneumonia caused by common upper respiratory tract bacteria. And other studies also looked at the same issue. The reason I bring this up today is to sort of bring the importance of understanding bacterial infections and viral infections that may work in synergy with each other, that may work together and sort of reinforce the challenges of public health. Just as in 1918, it was virus and then bacteria, it might happen again. And some of the data from China and Italy and perhaps in the United States as well shows that there is concern. We already know that increasing numbers of antibiotics are being used in our hospitals. And we also know that in the early 2000 epidemic of SARS in China, the part of the world that saw sort of increase in cases or a spike in cases also saw AMR, antimicrobial resistance, develop there. I often get this question of why would I write a book? In my discipline, in biomedical engineering, and even in sciences, typically the means of communication are scientific papers that are written, that are rich in jargon and are written with sort of a narrow focus. Writing books is quite uncommon. And part of my response to that is exactly that scientific papers have tremendous value, but they often reach a very particular audience. I want to write for my daughter's high school teacher. I want to write for my neighbor, my aunt and uncle in Pakistan. I want to write for my colleagues in Africa. I want to write for my neighbor who may not have read a book on science before. And it's important in this time that we engage people in science and discussion that is rooted in science and is written for a broad general audience. I also write for another reason. Scientific papers, as we know, are written with a conservative view. In other words, in a defensive view. You write sort of to inoculate yourself against any criticism, whereas a book gives you a little bit of room to expand that horizon, to talk about the history of a problem just as you talk about the science of that problem, to speculate a little, to dream a little, and to engage people in that process. And of course, I write because I feel that scientists and scholars have a responsibility to bring forward both the successes of our time and our sort of pursuit and our failures, to be honest, to be empathetic, and also to be humble. So I want to sort of talk about not necessarily the stories in the books, but some of the things that I found interesting and fascinating. Anybody who has ever worked with bacteria would sort of classify bacteria as gram positive or gram negative. Who was this Gram? So I went on his trail, both in Germany, where he worked and got his PhD, and in Copenhagen, where he was from. His great-granddaughter is still alive. And Hans Christian Gram was this unassuming scientist from Copenhagen who worked in Germany and was working on the biggest challenge of his time, and that happened to be pneumonia. And he, in his sort of unassuming way, came up with a simple method that is used even to this date to classify one kind of bacteria from another. About a year ago, in September 2019, there was a Google Doodle about him. Many people still don't know much about him. I certainly did not. But he's among many, many people whose contributions have shaped our own understanding of what bacteria are and how they operate. And the book is full of those kinds of stories as a reminder that science is a collective process of great, famous heroes and heroines and those whose name we do not remember. of the great people, or the great names rather, not great people necessarily, two names are really important here. One is Louis Pasteur on the left-hand side, and one is Robert Koch on the right-hand side. Both of these individuals were remarkable in terms of their sort of array of discoveries and their contribution, but they also had very real failings. When it came to Louis Pasteur, he was a larger-than-life character, sort of had a flair for theater. His big sort of claims about vaccines were actually not true. He didn't know anything about vaccines, nothing at all. The formula that he used was copied from a competitor who he refused to give credit. And we found out about this about 80 years after he died through his notebooks that were unsealed after his last descendant passed away. Robert Koch, again, a great name in science and a person whose contribution is really remarkable. But when it came to really pushing his discoveries on Africans, there was a huge problem here. In German East Africa, which is now modern-day Uganda or Tanzania, Koch went and used his drug called atoxyl to cure sleeping sickness. It didn't do anything except for the fact that it caused blindness in the people who were recruited forcibly and really damaged sort of their lives and their livelihoods. And it's important for us to really recognize both the contributions of individuals and their very real failings. And I think that's an important lesson for me, and also I hope for my readers as we move forward. Of course, there were others as well. There were people who discovered bacteriophages, viruses that can actually kill disease-causing bacteria. Frederick Tort is the person on the left. Felix Direl is the person in the middle. Felix was, again, this French-Canadian larger-than-life character who didn't give any credit to Frederick Tort and became so famous that Sinclair Lewis wrote a novel, Aerosmith, about him that got the Pulitzer Prize. Well, Sinclair never really went to accept it because he wasn't interested in this, and that sort of increased the sales of the book even further. But phages sort of vanished from history, partly because it became a Soviet science. Stalin was very interested, and the West at that time was interested in other technologies, and anything that was coming from Soviet Union was sort of met with great suspicion. There were other reasons as well. Antibiotics were cheaper to make, and they could make them in great numbers. But now phages are back, and sort of we have sort of gone back in time and history to really rediscover the work of Tort, Direl, and the work done at the Phage Institute in Georgia, Stalin's home state. Of course, no story about antibiotics would be complete without the work of Sir Alexander Fleming and his sort of legend about the open window and the mold and the discovery of penicillin, except for the fact that historians now agree that that story is actually made up. There's very little likelihood that he left that window open, that opened in a street that was that busy. No good microbiologist would ever do that. And also, that story was remarkably similar to other stories that he had told in the past. So what really happened? We don't know for a fact, except for the fact that, yeah, there was mold, but probably didn't come from that window that is famously depicted in most pictures with Fleming in his lab. But even before the penicillin became sort of the blockbuster drug of the Second World War, there was another drug called sulphur drugs that were used at the time. And that story is actually very important to tell. They were used and abused all across the world to the point of saving the lives of one of the biggest celebrities, the President of the United States, his son, FDR Jr. But by the time the Great War raged in Europe, Brigadier General Elliot Cutler was based in Boston originally and was involved in the Western theater in the war. When he was asked by the British parliamentarians, does the drug work? He said no. Antimicrobial resistance had arrived even before penicillin was to become the blockbuster drug of its time. Soon after the war, penicillin during the war, of course, penicillin gets a big boost from the US science. Penicillin also becomes a problem. Soon after the war, when Sir Alexander Fleming got the Nobel Prize, he sort of argued that, well, we may have a time when penicillin may not work. And that time came very, very soon. One of the unsung leaders of science is Dr. Mary Barber. the first person to argue that not only penicillin resistance is real, it can happen in people who haven't even taken penicillin. You know, this is one of those papers, lucid, clear, direct to the point, and with amazing data. It's only a page and a half long. It's available online, and it tells a story that should give us shivers. But people didn't listen. People continued in their particular way. They believed that there would be a new drug. If penicillin didn't work, well, there would be something else. And for a short time, there was. A new drug came on the market called methicillin. And after that, there was another warning, this time by Dr. Patricia Javins, arguing that methicillin doesn't work all the time. You abuse it and it stops working. And with methicillin resistance came something that still worries doctors all over the world. It's called methicillin resistant staph aureus, or for short, MRSA. Doctors all over the world, including in Boston, are really scared about MRSA that is acquired in the community and MRSA that is acquired in the hospitals. And it was in Boston, in the Boston City Hospital, that the first case of MRSA in the United States was isolated by somebody named Max Finland. It has become part of our health system ever since. I don't want to talk about all the people who've made these wonderful discoveries and sort of the hubris of the pharma industry, but I want to talk about something that we often don't pay much attention to. The fact that resistance is a natural process. Resistance has been there ever since bacteria have been around for billions of years. And this was a surprise to me as well when I started working on this issue. Two professors, Hazel Barton from University of Akron in Ohio and Jerry Wright from Canada, from Ontario, they did a very simple experiment. They said, we are going to go to the caves where no person has ever gone before. And Dr. Barton on the top left is a cave microbiologist. She studies how bacteria evolve in caves and how do they form biofilms and colonies. So they went in and they scooped up bacterial films from this cave system, one of the largest in the world, Lechigoya Caves in New Mexico. And it turns out that the bacteria there were resistant to some of the leading antibiotics, proving that resistance has been there from the very beginning. Bacteria evolve to create new antibiotics, and we have used those to sort of make those in the lab or make those in our companies. And other bacteria, in order to survive, come up with mechanisms to rebut that attack, rebut that assault. And that sort of arms race has been going on for a long time, back and forth, back and forth. What has happened is that humans have tipped that balance through greed and hubris and bad policies and not paying attention to sort of evolution. They've tipped the balance in favor of the bacteria that are resistant. A similar story happened in the earlier part of this millennium when an uncontacted Yanomami tribe was discovered at the border of Venezuela and Brazil. And according to standard practices, anytime you contact them, you have to immunize them. And in this case, before they immunized the members of the tribe, they collected their skin samples and fecal samples, again, nothing invasive. And what they found was, once again, the same situation. Their fecal samples and their skin samples had genes that were resistant to some of the leading antibiotics, telling us that bacterial resistance is actually normal, but what we are doing is playing with nature here, sort of a Russian roulette, so to speak, that is tipping the balance in the favor of resistance. One of the other lessons that I think is important in this regard is to know that antibiotic resistance in bacteria is more than about bad patients and bad doctors. So what do I mean by that? We often think that people are bad patients. You prescribe antibiotics for 7 days or 5, you feel better after 2, you stop taking them, and that develops resistance. That's true. Or doctors are under pressure to prescribe antibiotics when they don't need it. When a kid has a sore throat, the mom or the dad pressurizes the doctor, the pediatrician, to give antibiotic even though the kid doesn't have strep throat. Some doctors resist, some don't, because they're worried about their practice. And indeed, that is a problem. That's a problem all over the world. But there are other issues as well, things that go beyond bad patients and bad doctors. A classic example of that is conflict. At the beginning of this millennium, in the second Gulf conflict, US armed forces started developing resistance to a particular bacteria, in this case, Acinetobacter baumannii, to the point that it became such an issue that people at Walter Reed got really concerned. Congress started having special sessions to figure out what was going on. The technical term was too difficult to pronounce, so a moniker was introduced, Iraqibacter, a bacteria that US armed forces was getting from Iraq. It wasn't there before the war. Now it is there. The US forces may have left, but the problem is now endemic. I work closely with my colleagues at American University of Beirut in Lebanon, and 2/3 of the patients there who come with trauma come with Acinetobacter resistance. The kids who weren't even born at the time of the conflict now have to deal with this. War destroys infrastructure. It takes medical personnel out of the system. It also contaminates waterways and soil. And it also brings new metal to the environment, allowing the bacteria to grow and become resistant. This is not just a problem in Iraq and in Syria, it's a problem in Afghanistan. This is from CNN just about a year ago, last October. So we have to think about this problem not just as a doctor-patient relationship or a consumer who takes antibiotics when he or she shouldn't. It's also about international peace and conflict. In places like Yemen, where the infrastructure is completely destroyed, there is a real concern about, is it going to be the place where next superbug is going to come from? And now we know that things that start elsewhere can come to the United States, to Europe, to Australia, everywhere in the world. This is a story from 2 months ago in Foreign Policy, talking about farms in China as petri dishes of antibiotic resistance. And here, my point is not about China. It is also about my own country in Pakistan, where I was there about a year and a half ago, and I went to this largest buffalo colony in the world, about 440,000 buffaloes in a total area of 4 square kilometers. And this is how you enter it. A place that is polluted, a place where hygiene standards are nowhere to be found. A place where feed is full of antibiotics. A place where buffaloes are kept next to each other in an urban area. Hundreds of buffaloes in a room. And that milk goes to a city of about 22 million people every day, twice a day. As we in this country grapple with hundreds of years of subjugation and discrimination, I think it's also important to reflect that the same lesson applies all over the world. This is a picture that I took from northern Uganda, not very far from South Sudan, where I was last year, right around this time. And as we went to that place, we noticed that the antibiotics there are stored in high heat, and they should be in a cool and dry place. And when you get sick, you don't get the antibiotics that you need. You get the antibiotics that they have. If they just have Cipro, well, that's what you get. Doesn't matter whether you need Cipro or not. People who are on the margins of society, refugees, internally displaced people, people who are subjugated, whether in this country or elsewhere, they are going to suffer more and most whenever pandemic strikes. And we know that in COVID, and we know that from other data as well in pandemics. So as we think about antimicrobial resistance, we ought to think about who is going to be the one who's going to be most effective. And in the last couple of minutes, I want to sort of talk about where we are and where we ought to be. And I'm really honored that my friend and mentor and colleague, Professor Kevin Outterson, is sort of here and sort of co-hosting this event. And his work has shown the problem and also where the solutions might lie. Let's do a sort of a hypothetical experiment. Think of yourself as head of a large publicly traded pharmaceutical company, and you can invest in antibiotics, or you can invest in chronic disease drugs, cancer, or neuromuscular disorders, or cardiovascular disease. Well, people will take antibiotics if you have it for 4, 5, 10 days, or they'll take drugs for chronic diseases for the rest of their lives. The business models are very different, and certainly the one for antibiotics doesn't seem the most exciting one. Let's do another experiment, or a thought experiment. You come up with the next best antibiotic out there. People are excited. This is really wonderful. And the government says, well, great job, but you can't actually use it. You can't sell it unless there's an acute and a dire emergency. What that means is that the pharma companies are going to be not excited about it. If you look at the data, and this is slightly dated data, antibiotics in the pipeline do not paint the picture of a most robust, exciting sort of pipeline. The pipeline is weak. Some would call it dry. In general, very few, as little as 2% of antibiotics would make it from the beginning to the end. And if you only have 40 something, well, 2% is not going to be exciting. So we have to change the way we do things. We have to use new models, partnerships that allow small companies to go over these sort of valleys of death where antibiotics and discovery and translation just fails. And Carbex is one example of that. And I'm not saying that because Kevin is here, but I talk about that in the book as well, that we have to come up with new models, new ways of rewarding, new ways of thinking, how do you create a public good that helps everyone? My last slide is the one that that really sort of points to the challenge that we have. If we do the way we have been doing things, where it's all about profits of pharma, where it's all about sort of big returns on investment, antibiotics are not going to cut it. I remember Kevin saying about perhaps a month ago or a couple of weeks ago, I can't remember when exactly he said it, but he was right. He said that a year ago, if somebody told you, any of you, that we have the most efficacious vaccine for coronavirus, the exact value of that would have been 0. Nobody would have been interested. So that tells you how rapidly things change and how our models are broken. My last point is the one that I started with. This is not a science problem alone. This is not an economics problem alone. This is not just a public policy problem alone. All of these components have to play a role and have to play a pivotal role. There has to be everybody on the table. And once everybody comes on the table, the very reasons we are in this mess, the very reasons we have not paid attention is how we're going to get out of this. By all working together, by taking care of each other, by being kinder to those who don't have a voice, by thinking about how we treat our animals, by thinking about those who may not have the best health care, and by making sure that we preserve and protect some of the best resources we have to treat our infections before it becomes too late. So I'll end here. I know there are sort of folks here who may have questions, and I'm sure you may have thoughts as well, concerns, disagreements, but I'm honored that you came, and I'm looking forward to sort of having a conversation with you on this.
Yeah, Mohammed, thank you so much for that. You know, a delightful introduction to the book, and also I think people get a good sense of the sort of person you are, the sort of researcher, and also the humanity that at which you approach this project, and really a lot of things that you do. I want to remind people that there's the Q&A function. I have a couple of questions preset, but please type those in, and we'll take them in order. So I want to thank you in particular for mentioning the evolutionary ecological aspects of this. That it's not just that we've introduced something, but it's really that we've gone out of balance. There's interesting work, not just Jerry Wright's work, but looking all over rare places in the earth, and really what we see is that a lot of the products that we have, the antibiotics we have today, were derived in some form from natural products, and those natural products are the result of hundreds of millions, or up to 1 billion years of evolutionary struggle, maybe in the soil or in other ecological niches. And so one way of thinking about what we've done in this past 80 years since the discovery and mass production of penicillin is we've burned through possibly a billion years worth of evolutionary deposit in 80 years or less than a century. And so maybe there's other things I know in your book that talks about this. How can we devise solutions that think about this as an ecological and evolutionary issue instead of just, hey, let's go get a magic pill and that'll be the fix?
So, Kevin, that's a great question and a very troubling one, and it doesn't build confidence in human race and its greed. I mean, we're seeing some of that with climate change. We're seeing some of that with sort of environmental catastrophes. If you go to Amazon, if you go to parts of Southeast Asia, I don't think we have a billion years to replenish all of that. What we do have, I certainly don't. I hope the human race does. What I think is important is a broader message, and that message is of preservation, whether it is environment and sort of coexistence, or is it sort of preservation of our greatest values. Slightly different topic, but I was in Colombia, in Bogota in November of last year, right after Thanksgiving. And they said, well, we have not treated the indigenous communities very well, but now we think that they knew something about how to treat the trees and the waterways and sort of how to protect and preserve the environment. We have a lot to learn from them. And I was like, really? We I think have gone too far in what we would call this hubris and this great sense of misplaced optimism that there will always be a new drug out there right around the corner. Some of the, you know this better than I do, we haven't had success with some of these antibiotics for 50 odd years. For most of them, good 30, 40 years. And we've burned through things very well. And some of the ones that were perhaps even promising were left because they were not as profitable as what else was on the market. So looking at vancomycin and others, there were a bunch of drugs. But vancomycin was going to give you the biggest bang for the buck. So that became the drug of choice, and everybody sort of jumped on that bandwagon. So we sort of rejected a number of good options back then in 50s and 60s. So the evolutionary story is important to know that there is still, I think, hope. But at the same time, it's also troubling for somebody like me to see that we are not doing enough at an individual level to appreciate how much we have run through the resources. When I talk to my colleagues in Scandinavia, where there is a higher, I think, sensitivity towards resources, they consider antibiotics to be their own personal treasure, and in many cases that has been the public sensibility, that they consider it something that has to be preserved as something that has to be consumed. And I think that sensitivity is important. That sensitivity is not going to come from my lab. That's not going to come from a pharma company. That is going to come from a broader public understanding of what is it that we owe to society and to the future generations.
Mm. Yeah, you're making a case for science to be engaged with the rest of civilization and the rest of the world. If I'd like to say sometimes that infectious diseases are a test of the mettle of our civilization in some way, right? In many ways. Everything that's going on right now, do you think this is a test we're going to pass? Or are you a pessimist or an optimist? I guess I'm asking on.
So, Kevin, I'm not a betting man, but if I was betting on this, let's say if I had my stock in civilization and I wanted to cash out tomorrow, I think I will cash out because it doesn't look very good with nationalism and sort of xenophobia and me first and all of that. I think I do have greater hopes from my kids and hopefully one day my grandkids' generation that things will be different. If somebody were to say, are you worried about tomorrow? The answer is yes. I think not only do we not learned from that, but increasingly across the board in this current pandemic, we have seen time and time again this notion of ideology over science, sort of vindictiveness over kindness, scapegoating over inclusion. We have seen time and time again people not accepting the fact that they can be wrong. And I often tell people that, what you ought to trust is not science alone, but the scientific process. What matters here is not sort of an individual finding, some kind of a fact that can be disputed, but the fact is, how do you really get to that point, and how do you have a debate about it? And that's far more important. When I look at my kids, when I talk to them, I see a greater sense of optimism than when I talk to my colleagues. So I would say that I am hopeful. 15 to 20 year time, less so for about tomorrow.
So we have a couple of questions, several in fact. I'm going to combine a couple of them and give them to you in a batch. One is, how in the world could we have gotten resistance in those secluded caves? And then the second batch of questions is really, should we fear about this issue, bacterial infection, in the current COVID pandemic? And what could we as people or as patients do to counteract some of these problems that you're describing?
So let me answer the first question first. How did they end up in New Mexico? That's a great question. And without sort of giving too much of what the story there is in the book, it tells you how remarkable evolution is. And so let's think about a simple experiment. Let's do it in our mind. If there was a bacteria that was able to produce antibiotics and kill its competitors, well, that would be the only bacteria available today. That would be the only one around. But the fact is that there are countless species of bacteria. So there is this arms race that is going on. And, one of the things we've started doing in my family is we watch sort of movies with my kids. And one of the movies that we saw recently, because it was when I was young and the kids hadn't seen it, it was Jurassic Park. And in Jurassic Park, Ian Malcolm says life finds a way. So life does find a way, even in deep sort of Lechiguaya caves in New Mexico. And when life finds a way, it finds a way in all of its beautiful manifestations. So the bacteria get there, and then there is a war going on between very different kinds of bacteria. And sort of that tension really allows them to create some of the antibiotics that we see. But the answer, if I was to be honest, we don't know all of the reasons and all of the ways in which those antibiotics are produced. And that's what Jerry Wright would also tell you, that we know some, but we don't know all of them. And that's, I think, both the mystery and the optimism of science. And the other question. So the other question that you asked is, what should we do? Well, what I will do, Kevin, is I'll answer it partly and I'll turn it back to you, because you are far more engaged in sort of different groups, advocacy, and sort of in the different domains. I think we ought to look at ourselves deeply. We ought to ask ourselves that, are we doing things that are just not scientifically sound? I'm guilty of that myself. If my kid has a sore throat, I do want the doctor to prescribe an antibiotic because I have a trust in antibiotic, not necessarily wanting to just take lemon tea with honey. If the doctor says, I will now, I hope, behave differently, but in the past, I may have sort of applied gentle pressure and, well, do you really think it's going to go away? There may be an antibiotic. And we ought to do that. We ought to really think about that. We also have to be thinking about that. Do we really want to have antibiotics coming into the animal feed and sort of prophylactic ways or growth promoters, because we are so deeply entrenched in our way of life and having meat at the table all the time? I'm not saying that that is something that I'm advocating, that people should become vegans or vegetarians. My point is not that. My point is that we ought to treat animals nicely. We ought to really look at how do we sort of raise our animals, and perhaps we don't need to put streptomycin in citrus fruits in Florida to avoid greening disease. Anyway, what do you think, Kevin?
Yeah, I like to say that a drug-resistant infection anywhere is a drug-resistant infection everywhere. We can't do anything here without global action. It doesn't do us any good to try to fix it for Boston or fix it for Massachusetts or fix it for the United States. It has to be a global solution. And again, I like the ecological evolutionary approach because it just opens up so much territory in how we respond. And so, like, if you took the ecological idea and put it down to the level of the individual, you get the entire discussion for the past decade on the microbiome, right? And so that's an argument to a patient. Why should I not take or give this antibiotic to my kid? It might help them, right? And they may get to go back to school back in the days in which our kids got to go to school. But now the story is you actually may also be hurting your child, not hurting some child far distance from your child, because you're going to, affect their microbiome and change the bacteria that are resident, in a healthy child over time. So that's a different way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I absolutely agree.
Now, when you're writing this book, knowing you, I think you probably made friends all over the world.
I did.
But I can't believe that writing a book like this is particularly good for a scientist. I mean, you're too engaging, you're too human, you're too humane. There's too much humility. I'm making fun a little bit here, but this is an unusual sort of book for a serious, bench scientist to be writing, and I thank you for it. But maybe you can tell me about some of the interesting people you met, or you can respond to that question about, how this fits in your career plans.
So many different things here, Kevin. First of all, I think my kids will object to this argument of serious scientist, right? So I don't know if they consider me either a scientist or serious or
there you go.
That. But in my field, Kevin, writing a book for general audience is not particularly, it's not common, it's not encouraged. It doesn't bring any real sort of, there's no incentive for that from an academic landscape. As a matter of fact, there might be disincentive. Carl Sagan first was denied tenure at Harvard because he was too involved in public debate. And he would often say that the more he engages with the public, the less the astronomy community wants to engage with him, because he must not be very good, according to them, if he's engaging with the public as opposed to talking to the 5 people who know what he's talking about. And I think there are several problems with our approach. One, I feel that more people need to bring public into their conversation. And that doesn't mean that you sort of dumb down science. That just means that you choose the words and the expression, the framework and the language that allows more people to engage. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think scientists have great stories to tell as well. So why shouldn't they? I think there's a lot we have to offer, just as a historian would, or a lawyer would, or a doctor would. But I think the academic structure, certainly in this country, and I think to a certain extent in Europe as well, but certainly in this country, are designed so that you become more narrower and narrower in your writing as opposed to broader and broader. And that hasn't worked very well, unfortunately.
The joke about that is that you learn more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing.
There
you go. We're just so focused.
And I'm all for expertise. I'm not at all against that. But I think there's something lost if at a time like this, you're unable to communicate with our neighbors and our parents and our kids and their teachers. And I think that's just sad.
Especially for a problem that requires all of us to work together to solve.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And so, so I also consider myself to be very privileged and very blessed here that I have tenure and I don't have to worry about sort of getting the acceptance of my peers when I write for the public audience. But I have gotten, not necessarily only from my university, but from others, this sort of these snide remarks about sort of that if this is what you're doing, then you must not be doing science, because this is not science, or this is not worthy of the time of the scientist. And there was an article in Chronicle of Higher Education about a month ago that said that writing for the public doesn't mean that it needs to be any less rigorous. It sometimes has to be even more rigorous, because you have not only the burden of covering all that science and history and things like that, you also have to pay attention to word choices and sentence structure and a narrative. And I consider myself so fortunate that I worked with such a wonderful editorial team. I wrote the first draft, and it didn't go very well. And so I had to rewrite the whole thing. And my editor asked me something that I hadn't thought of. She said, "So who's the protagonist in the book?" I was like, "What do you mean? I mean, this is a book about the history of antimicrobial resistance. Why do I need a protagonist?" He said, "Well, every book needs to have a protagonist." So I spent a lot of time thinking about it. And with her help, and credit where it's due, we said, well, science itself and the scientific enterprise is the protagonist. It doesn't have to be an individual in a lab or somebody in a high office. And that was just, I mean, the whole book became so much more clearer, and became sort of just all of my research and all of these post-it notes that were just flying around sort of just became so structured once I learned how to write a narrative. And I consider myself extremely fortunate, and I want to continue with that. And I hope that we will have an opportunity at BU and elsewhere where we will have more scientists in a writing club of how do you really tell the story? How do you engage the audience? How do you really tell them the tale of what you're working on, as opposed to 4 people who can decipher it, and you have 5 equations and words around it and no structure. I'll come to that.
So I just want to, thank you for making it through all that struggle to write the book. It's they're sort of bite-sized chapters for those of you who haven't read it yet. It's the sort of thing that, you could read a chapter every night before bed. And I read it, and I thought I knew a lot about this area. I learned a lot about the people, in the antibacterial world, and it's just really fascinating. But somebody's asked a question that, what was the best story that didn't make it into the book?
Yeah,
but I have to push back at that a little bit, because there's so many interesting ones who did make it in.
Well,
that's the question that came in from the audience.
That's a fair question. There were stories that didn't make to the book, and there were parts of stories that didn't make it to the book. So one of the people I met, and so one of the things that happened throughout this course of writing the book was that not only did I meet new people, but people sort of opened their homes. So Tore Midvedet, who is in his late 80s, and sort of this really phenomenal guy in Norway, who did sort of came up with a computer program well before this was sort of cool thing to do in Norway, and lost most of his discs and then sort of recovered them. I went to see him for about half hour. I spent a whole day with him and his wife, who is also very elderly. She cooked for us, and it was just an amazing sort of time with him in his sort of lounge. And I mean, and then there were other stories that I thought were exciting. But one of the things that you have to learn is, when you work with very good editors, they have an eye of repetition. And I thought they were all different stories, and she felt that not quite. So there were many stories in there that I felt were different and distinct, but she felt that I've already made the point, and do not think of your reader as the pupil in your classroom who needs to be reminded the same thing over and over again. Your reader is somebody who is smart and educated and can get the point. So you don't have to say the same thing from 3 different stories. So there were stories about farmers in Bangladesh that I thought were very interesting that didn't make it, but because the same point had been made. Similarly, sort of pig farms or sort of these shrimp farms in Thailand. And she said, well, you've talked about farms once. You don't have to sort of go through every single country and talk about that. There were other stories that I thought were interesting, but, well, maybe they're for the next book.
I appreciate that. Science history is, I don't know, frequently white and European or American and male, the way it's written. I like the way that you work pretty hard to try to broaden the scope of what sort of people and stories are represented in the book. And so thank you for that.
Well, Kevin, I did not sort of set out to choose one kind of stories. I just wanted to go and find the best story. So one of the things that and some of these moments were just uncomfortable and weird, because what I had been told and what we thought that it was male British scientist was often not the male British scientist who made that discovery. When it was said that all sort of the great things that have happened in the world of antibiotics happened in this nice and pristine lab somewhere in Oxford and Cambridge, well, that wasn't the case. And so my own preconceived notions were checked and checked again so many times, as they are being checked now, thinking that United States, being sort of this great innovation hub, will figure out how to handle coronavirus, when Vietnam is the success story with 0 deaths, when Uganda is a success story, right? So I think some of our preconceived notions and hubris have been checked many times, even in the last 3 months, which is important. And I think we just have to keep our eyes open and our hearts big to know that, well, things are not quite always what they seem. But there were things that were concerning. I spent some time in Russia because I was interested in sort of figuring out what was happening on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and those Soviet archives are quite something. And you wonder about sort of these totalitarian states that sort of have information about everyone and everything. And so I was talking to colleagues, and they said that despite the fact that many of those archives are open, and the same is true in East Germany, people don't go to those archives because they know that the details about their parents were given by their loved ones. There was no other way that much detail was available about an individual unless his or her partner and neighbor and kids were spying on them. So some of it was very painful for people there, especially in these totalitarian states. And I spent some time in Russia. I talked to people in East Germany. And it tells you again about human behavior. So it's a story about bacteria, but bacteria seem to be a lot more transparent in their dealings than humans are.
Boston's the home for a lot of shiny biotech labs, including your lab at Boston University. A million miles away in terms of, the setting would be a refugee camp. And I know that that's a nexus of your work and this article, this book, and your other work is refugee camps. And I thought maybe you could tell a little bit about how you came to go to refugee camps and what you're trying to do with engineering related to that.
Kevin, I grew up in Pakistan at a time when there were refugees coming in from Afghanistan because of Soviet invasion. This is late 1970s and early 1980s. And I grew up in an environment which I hate to admit was fairly xenophobic, right? All the problems were because of this outsider, this person who's not from here, terrorism, theft, smuggling, drugs. And it was much later in life that I realized that how wrong that whole notion, how wrong those whole ideas are. And what bothers me tremendously is that we can argue about sort of this great world that we live in and equality and equity, but there are people who have absolutely no agency, political, social. They are stateless. They have no voice, and they also get sick, like my kids, like your kids. They also want to get better. And so who's going to take care of them? And I'm not doing this work because I think there's some sort of I'm on a mission, but because I think that is just a human thing to do. We got to pull other people up, and other people will pull us up. In the refugee camps, the issue of antimicrobial resistance is particularly tricky. One is, as I mentioned, you don't get the antibiotic that you need, you get what is available. You also sort of decide to get 5 pills and you use 3 because kid number 2 will get sick and will need something. You also are worried because you don't trust the person who's dispensing those drugs. Probably that person doesn't sort of wish you well, right? So there's that element of fear, of anxiety. There's also this notion of the fact that you're feeling scared all the time. You don't have a lot of money. And so all of these things, infectious disease in general, in these places, many are cramped and have sort of high sort of sanitation and sewage problems. The sad reality, Kevin, is that we have not studied the problem of antimicrobial resistance in these places as much as we want to. And I want to do that, both as a scientific question, but also as something that may give us insights into how wrong we've been and how to take care of people who've fallen on hard times, not because of any fault of theirs, but because of how unjust the society is. And I hope that we will be able to make some inroads in that. One of the things that gives me hope is that people are smart and resilient. We've seen this in the case of coronavirus, that some of the refugee camps decided to be proactive themselves. And we hope that other things can happen as well. But we all have to do our part, especially in places where taking care of other people is a collective responsibility, and we are failing on that.
Yeah, you mentioned growing up in Pakistan. There's an interesting, history of, quite a few of the characters in your book. I mean, they actually were immigrants. You mentioned Hans Christian Gram, but there's a lot of the history of any science, but also this particular area of science, in which immigration has played a role. And if you're willing to wade into it, just what are we putting at risk presently in the United States by our administration sharply limiting the flow of not just immigrants on a human level, but also immigration on a scientific level?
Absolutely, Kevin. And the notion of building bigger walls and this kind of exclusion doesn't work. The book starts with somebody who was a US citizen, born and bred, who goes abroad, gets an infection, comes back to Nevada, of all places, because that's where she's from, 70-something-year-old person. And the infection just doesn't get better. And she unfortunately passes away because of infection, despite every single antibiotic that we have available was used. So this notion of limiting sort of travel, or limiting sort of making bigger walls, is not going to work. So that's, I mean, there's no evidence it will, there's no evidence it can, and there's plenty of evidence that it cannot. But I think one of the things that we have to learn is that sort of migration of people, migration of ideas, and respecting people is one of the greatest assets of science. One of the biggest strengths of science in this country and elsewhere is to be able to listen and is to be able to understand the challenges that sort of affect us commonly. And the great idea may come from Uganda, or it may come from China, or it may come from Vietnam, and we all will be better off for it. Even in sort of the great discovery of penicillin, the person, Ernest Chain, was a Jewish refugee from Germany who ends up in Oxford. And it's the kindness of the local community that keeps him there and doesn't get him deported back to Nazi Germany. And he is the one who sort of makes penicillin possible. So even in that sort of world of 1940s, and I'll address the question that Dale Evan asks, which I think is important as well. Migration of people has played a role. And while we want to encourage sort of countries to become stronger, and I certainly am an example of somebody from Pakistan who lives here but continues to work with the institutions in Pakistan and strengthen, hopefully will perhaps strengthen some of the research infrastructure. And I think that's important. But the right answer is to build things there and help the scientific community, not necessarily exclude them from coming, right? So I believe that sort of there is a disproportionate sort of infrastructure in different countries that doesn't allow great minds to thrive. But at the same time, we also shouldn't create a sense of xenophobia. We don't want, I mean, if you tell people that the solution to brain drain is not going to come from saying that you guys are bad and evil or whatever, don't come to my country. It is going to come from the idea that we will collectively develop, and let's hope and work on problems together. And we can. Migration, there's a book by Sonia Shah, The Next Great Migration, that talks about migration as a natural phenomenon. Has always happened. People in this country, by and large, their ancestors came from somewhere else, unless you were a Native American. Migration does happen. It can happen, it will happen, but creating a sense of others, that you are bad because your skin color is this, or your religion is this, or you come from a country that is poor or communist or totalitarian, that is the wrong way, and that is not going to help science. We are seeing that already with the new orders about immigration, about visas, about H-1 visas, about green cards, and that is not going to help anyone.
I like to think that in resistance, what we're doing is trying to create global public goods. And wherever it's most efficient to create that, it's going to be good for the whole planet, once we've done that.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate your questions. I think that's all the questions.
And I think we're right on time as well, because we don't want to keep people away from, I already spoiled your dinner, but I don't want to sort of...
I volunteered. Spoiled is a harsh word.
No, thank you so much, Kevin. I really appreciate it. And thank you for colleagues who stuck around. And I hope you'll buy the book. I hope you'll read the book. And I hope you'll reach out to me about sort of comments and criticisms. And I really want to hear from all of you.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. This was really wonderful. Thanks to all of you out there for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about this important book and purchase Biography of Resistance at the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Mass., have a good night, keep reading, and please, everybody, be well.
You too. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.